Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the first session of our July members meeting, which we've now titled OnGo Insights. Thanks again. Have a nice program, I think, today, as well as going forward the next several days with the sessions tomorrow, as well as the various working group sessions. So thank you all for being here. It is greatly appreciated. Hope you find much of this interesting. On the next slide, one of the things we do want to point out is there is a chat window where labeled stage that you'll be able to submit questions to the various panels or various sessions. We will capture all the questions. As many of them that we can answer live, we will do so. But we will capture all the questions and include them in the materials that we publish after the meeting with this recording and the other the presentation, etc. So rest assured, all the materials will be available. You will be notified where they will be located, so you don't have to worry about taking shots of the screen here. It will be something that you can access at the appropriate time. So our next slide. Today, for the OnGo Insights session, I think we have a really intriguing program for you. I'll do a quick introduction, just again, kind of level set and provide you some overview information as to how things are proceeding in a very general way. We will move over to, I think, one of the more exciting and interesting topics that we have for us, which is talking about this TARDIS S3 as well as IIC. And we have a great speaker lined up as well that will be introduced here in a little bit. We also have a couple of deployment stories and some learning from practical implementation of bringing deployments into reality. Then some discussion about our regulatory update, our thoughts around other bands, other locations, and so some really interesting topics there. And then we'll close out with a fan favorite, our Sas Admin Panel, where we'll have some opportunity to hear from the Sas admins, ask a few questions, etc. So stay tuned for that. That will be our closing session. And again, we'll have an opportunity for questions all along the way. And again, if you're just joining us, materials will be available after the session, and you'll be able to download those, this recording, the slides, etc. So on to me and a quick introduction from me. What is OnGo Alliance? Many of you know, but again, we like to, especially for our guests, go over some of the materials. Go on to the next slide. Really high level, our purpose, and this purpose has evolved this year as we become the OnGo Alliance, is we're there to support the interest of our members, the implementers of the technology, operators, etc., where it comes to the deployment, the development, the commercialization, the adoption of specifically 3GPP-based technologies. We are currently focusing on the CBRS band, of course. That has been our history, but it is for any shared spectrum band. That's really the change that made us evolve into the OnGo Alliance, is now expanding to any band, anywhere that is utilizing shared spectrum and 3GPP-based solutions. Our mission along those lines is to evangelize 3GPP and the solutions that are based upon the work done by ETSI and the 3GPP folks, their use cases, the business opportunities, etc. Work on things that drive the technology developments necessary to do that, to make this purpose occur, to look at any advocacy activities, whether they be internal, external, lobbying, etc., to help make sure that everyone is aware and that the story is as widely understood as possible, and to really help drive the action to occur. And then finally, what you see here is develop an effective product certification program for the 3GPP-based equipment in the shared spectrum bands. And that means not only the current program, but what should the program evolve into. Next slide. So what do we do to make all this happen? There are a lot of activities. This is an incomplete list, but many of these things that some of you know, some of you may not know a few of them, but things like our technical specification development done in our technical working group, the liaisons and lobbying that we do on behalf of all Alliance members, the shared network identifier to allow easier deployments of private LTE networks and then eventually private 5G networks as well. The educational materials, the webinars, all of these different things, including, I'm sure you've almost grown tired of hearing about OnGo for Dummies, but it's one of those activities that fits into that educational materials. Working at trade shows, building out pavilions for our members to put their shared spectrum solutions front and center. Our web presence, our brand new website, which is really exciting and already showing just how we can get this message out even more effectively. And finally, talking about OnGo Awards and the OnGo Certified Mark. So the OnGo Awards is something we started last year and we will continue. And our OnGo certification program currently for CBSDs, but looking at where does that program go? Are there other network elements? Are there other things that we need to somehow recognize against the specifications that we develop? Next slide. So a quick history, and many of you know all of these points. Just want to reiterate that we started back in 2010 when the NTI identified the spectrum that we now know as the CBRS band for shared use. Going through this timeline, some of the key things is the identification of the OnGo branding at the beginning of 2018, the initial commercial deployments, middle of 2019, our full commercial service launch at the beginning of 2020. 2020 also included the PAL auction and our Release 3 specs that allowed for 5G mid-band deployments. There were a few other things that happened in 2020 that made our life a lot more interesting that you all know. But in spite of that and the way we work and the proof that virtual working and utilizing telecommunications effectively really underscored how we can still continue to be effective when things are at their most challenging. And then into this year, we became the OnGo Alliance, and again, the expansion of the specification development into supporting mid-band 5G, coexistence, etc. Next slide. And then just a very quick picture, won't belabor this one, but 5 working groups where our members do their work. And you see on the right, our technical and test insert group doing much of the technical work and turning that work into certification programs. On the left, our business working group, deployment and operations, investigating the ecosystem and helping understand the ecosystem so that the solutions that we are working towards implementing are effective, that they meet the needs of the ecosystem, and that we're not losing some key elements that would otherwise be overlooked. And then finally, in the middle, of course, our marketing working group, making sure that the messaging is effective, the education is effective, our relationship outside the organization is effective. Next slide. The eye chart that has become our members list, 185 member companies right now. Names that you see here are familiar and maybe a little less familiar, but all important because they are dedicated to really bringing this ecosystem into reality. So we could not do this without the reach that we've had from the infra, the operators, the end-to-end providers, the solutions, the antenna folks, the test labs. There's really no part of the ecosystem that isn't represented in some way here, and our intent is to grow that representation and also the quality of that representation into the Alliance. Next slide. So with that, what I would like to do is invite Mark Gibson up on the stage. And Mark has got us, I think, some really interesting insights about what's happening in IIC, TARDIS program, and then also leading into some other good discussion and one of our special guests for the day. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Alan. And so thanks for the invite. It's great to be here again, as usual. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the informant incumbent capability and TARDIS 3. Next slide, please. So a little background. Those of us CBRSers that are familiar with everything know that the Navy's radars are protected by a complex network of dynamic protection areas, or DPAs. And then, as indicated on this diagram to the left, those DPAs have a neighborhood associated with them, and any CBSD within that neighborhood is subject to being managed by the SAS to mitigate any interference when the ESC detects a radar. And then on the right is an example of what the ESC network looks like with those little teardrop dots there from Google Earth. It's a network of many hundreds of sensors that are meant to protect the DPAs. The next slide here shows the ground-based radars that we also have to protect. And what's interesting about these is these are protected by a portal that was developed by the SAS team. It was developed primarily by Google. Andy Clegg did most of the work on it. I did a little bit of help. But these radars are protected theoretically by a portal where anytime the government wants to use a radar, they enter information into the portal that describes information about the radar operation: location, time, duration, and frequency. Basically, that's it. And then the portal will go off and protect them. So keep that in mind as we go through. So what is the issue? Well, thinking about these sensors are very sensitive. They have to detect radar operation as far as 200 kilometers off the coast. And while those radars are pretty high powered, they're up to over a gigawatt. Once the gigawatt radar at 3 gig travels across the open sea, its signal is sufficiently attenuated so that the radar has to be very sensitive to pick that up. And by virtue of that, that means that the sensor could be interfered with by a CBSD deployed in the area around it. And so what that means is that for CBRS operation, there are areas around the radar, or around the sensors, that have to be managed a little bit more for CBRS operations so as not to interfere with interfere with the sensors. The other concern we have is that the 345 gig service, which is upcoming in the band right below, in fact, immediately below, that's a lot higher power operation, and that could cause issues as well. And so, but if you add up all the areas around the sensors where we have to protect CBRS operation, that could affect millions of Americans, as well as when you think about the 345 gig operation, it's many, many millions of Americans that could be affected with constrained operations. So next slide, Josh. So this slide shows sort of a picture of these things we call whisper zones that are around the sensors, again, to mitigate interference from the deployment. So on the left is and these are roughly the same area, they just look different because they were plotted at different times. But on the left shows the areas of constrained operation due to CBRS in the Southern California area that looks like it's Laguna Beach to Malibu. So those are areas within which CBRS operation has to be limited in terms of power and number of devices so as not to interfere with the sensors. And if we look at the area just under that, or the amount of population under that area, it's over 266,000 people, or about 120,000 households. So that's substantial constraint. And then on the right side shows the whisper zones related to the potential whisper zones related to the operation in the 345 gig band. The reason those are larger, even though that is adjacent channel, is that they have higher power. The maximum power in that band can be 32,000 kilowatts, or 32,000 watts, 32 kilowatts. And so that's much higher than the CBRS power at 50 watts. And so that's the concern that we have, is that the areas would be much larger. So that's the sum of the problem, but there are better and much more proven alternatives to deal with this, which have zero impact on CBRS and 345. So that's in the next slide. So next slide, Josh. So what is the solution? Well, there are really two programs that are under consideration or under development in the government right now. They're generally referred to as informing incumbent capability, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as incumbent informing capability, but they're still both I's, so it can still be IIC. On the one hand, we have the NTIA that's developing incumbent inform, actually they call it informing incumbent capability. Which is a program that they're working on, at least trying to work on, that would essentially do the same thing as our portal. And you can see here that by virtue of our portal, we've been able to use the portal that we developed as SAS administrators to actually protect American Samoa, which is an island out in the middle of the Pacific. And so, as I mentioned, this operation, actually I didn't mention, but this operation is in the spectrum from 3550 to 3650. And there are the ground-based radars that you saw earlier, like I said, are protected by that portal. And we had asked that portal be able to be used for the coastal radar operation, and the DoD declined. However, for American Samoa, they were fairly comfortable with the portal's capabilities that were allowing us to use that portal that we developed for American Samoa. So we're hoping that we'll be able to use that portal, or a portal, whether it's the one we developed or the one that's being worked on, I'll talk about in a moment, to effectuate protection of the sensors themselves as opposed to just the radar operation. So really, as I said earlier, there's two things going on. One is the NTIA is working on a program they're calling IIC, and then the DoD under DISA is working on a program that's called TARDIS, which stands for Telecommunications Advanced Research and Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Systems. So it's TARDIS 3, and the S3 part of it stands for Spectrum Scheduling System, and that's the aspect of it that we're very interested in. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see a little bit more information on that. So the incumbent informing capability that NTIA is deploying, or wants to deploy, operates pretty much like what you see on the right hand of the slide. Essentially, the spectrum operator, the federal spectrum operator, enters information into this portal. That information in the portal is made available to the spectrum access systems, and the commercial operator, the spectrum access systems, or the SASs, manage it accordingly. And the commercial spectrum operators, it really is transparent to them, other than there may be minor changes to their operations to protect radars. And so the great thing about this is that it takes the sensor out of the network, and it can happen really seamlessly. However, there are some concerns about it, which is one of the reasons that we feel that the DoD and NTIA are not using the portal that industry developed, and that has to do with security protections. There is a concern across many security domains that a federal spectrum officer entering information into this portal might be open to threats and to bad guys. And so those connections going to the IIC and then to the SCS, or the Spectrum Coordination System, which is the same thing as the SAS, might need to be at a higher security level, which is something that we couldn't do in our portal. So anyhow, this is the NTIA's approach. The next slide kind of gets into a little bit more detail about what they're thinking. Next slide, Josh. So I won't read all of this, but basically NTIA's vision is that the federal spectrum users would provide their data in the portal. And there's a lot of ways they could do it. It could be uploaded, just bulk uploaded, or it could happen sort of in real time. But the federal spectrum users' information would be put into this portal. And by the way, the one major difference between the IIC that NTIA is doing and TARDIS is that two major differences. One, the IIC that NTIA is developing has a broader effect. It's supposed to address sharing across any bands that are being shared with commercial and federal users, not just the CBRS band. The other thing is that the TARDIS program is being funded out of Spectrum Relocation Fund monies from the CBRS auction that generated $4.6 billion. So that's a funded project, whereas the IIC is looking for funding right now. Nonetheless, the way it would be used is the federal users would enter information into the portal. There'd be business rules and processes that would allow that data to be populated into a database with the proper protections. And then that information would be propagated to SASs in near real time. And then we think that this is a higher security level because the Navy has concerns about a broad network of sensors that sense their operation. In fact, we've had to defeature the sensors so that there is not the chance that we could use multiple sensors to pinpoint radar operation. That's not allowed, and we're not doing that. But this IIC would certainly obviate that absolutely. But that last bullet, that penultimate bullet there, is really what we're interested in, is that this IIC could replace the environmental sensing capability, and that's kind of what we're looking for. So if you go to the next slide, this is a timeline that shows how these things are coming together, and this is a timeline that I got out of an IIC presentation that NTIA did. And essentially, and I won't go into all of this, but it shows the TARDIS at the top. The spectrum scheduling system is supposed to be developed and released later this year. And that's supposed to be deployed and useful for the portal radars, and then ultimately in time be deployed for the sensing capabilities or the ESCs. But that time frame is far out there. There's a portal or a track at the bottom that is dealing with the automatic spectrum coordination system, which is for the 345 gig band. That's to allow carriers to enter coordination information for deployment and coordination with the 345 gig band. And I haven't talked a whole lot about the TARDIS, but there's some information here from the TARDIS's the request for white paper, which basically says the same thing that the IIC is, which is that the vision is for this to be ultimately deployed to replace the environmental sensing capability. So basically what you see through here is an IIC, which is being developed by NTIA, and a TARDIS that's being developed by DoD, hopefully coming together in the not too distant future to allow a lot more robust information coming into the SASs, and hopefully do away with the ESC, and thereby removing the potential impact for CBRS deployment and through 4.5 gig deployment as we move forward. So that's it. I'll turn it to Dave, who will give an introduction to our honored guest, Vernita Harris. Thank you. Dave, you're on mute.
Just like I'm testifying before Congress and somebody had to tell me I was on mute. Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for that great overview of what's going on with the informant and common capability, as well as the TARDIS initiatives. So we have had the honor and joy of having a number of leaders from the Department of Defense address us over the years. I'm thinking particularly of Mr. Fred Moorfield and Tom Taylor. I think the good news is that Fred has been promoted, but we have already had the privilege and honor of working with the very capable person who is fulfilling that very important role at DoD of overseeing spectrum policy and programs. And Vernita Harris, a very strong history in federal spectrum management, a long storied career at NTIA, both working on domestic issues, but in particular on a lot of the international issues. And given some of the meetings that we have had with Vernita and her team, particularly on the IIC and ESC situation that Mark just described, but also just more broadly on 3100 to 3450, and we know that Vernita again and her team have been extremely involved with the 345 work, both the AMBIT study and now there's a spectrum briefing that DoD held. I guess it was just 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, for the auction participants. So I'm going to shut up and just introduce Vernita Harris. We are honored to have her come and speak to us about, federal sharing with commercial, what's going on with 3.45, TARDIS, and really anything else that she might like to speak to our members about. So thank you for joining us, Vernita. We're honored to have you. Oh, I think you may be on mute now. Still not getting audio, at least me. Sounds like we're hearing the when you're moving something, I hear the kind of clicking, but I don't hear your voice. No. Oh, and now I'm back. So we'll just give Vernita a minute to get the audio sorted out. I know, no. Josh, is there a dial-in option? if we can't get the computer audio sorted?
Yes, there should be an audio option, Dave. We're pulling it up now.
Great. That may be an alternative. Let's see, I could sing, but that would really kill. We'd probably lose all of our audience if I started to do that. I was going to mention that I know I know Vernita and her team have been very involved in a lot of the recent discussions around the infrastructure bills and some suggestions about how 3100 to 3450 might play into that. So I don't know. I mentioned they're all extremely tired after this last flurry of activity. There's suggestions around headset, but let's see. Oh, that sounds better.
How about now?
Yes, lovely.
Okay. I guess I needed headsets. Sorry. Thank you.
Not at all.
Sorry for the technical difficulties. So Dave, thank you for the invitation to speak today. Thank you to OnGo Alliance for hosting this event. I believe bringing industry and government together to discuss our spectrum challenges is crucial for our national success in space. My name is Vernita De Harris, and I'm the Director of Spectrum Policy and Programs, or SPP for short. In the DoD CIO office, in essence, we serve as the DoD's SHERPA for advancing the Department Spectrum, Internet, Information, and Telecommunication Policy. We leverage a team of diverse cross-functional experts to navigate increasingly complex landscape and pursue the Department Spectrum interest across the executive, legislative branch, international community, and industry. I have worked in government service for over 20 years, the majority with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, where I worked on spectrum policy, issues, and international affairs. Before joining the government, I worked in private industry. Although I'm a relative newcomer to DoD, I'm supported by a deep team of policy and engineering experts. I find it deeply meaningful we support the work of our uniformed men and women downrange. They have access to the information they need at the moment it's needed to meet operational imperatives. The United States risks losing its military and economic edge if it does not control the electromagnetic spectrum. The economic and innovation advantages spectrum brings are no mystery to this audience. For the military, this range of frequencies is critical for communications, navigation, weapons system, and more. These two drivers for spectrum are often pitted against one another. However, the work DoD and OnGo Alliance continue to engage in validates the sharing model used in the 3.55 gigahertz band. The success we have witnessed in getting this band to industry while protecting national security missions and provides a model to emulate going forward. My remarks today reflect my strong belief that newer forms of sharing can lead to a future that ensures U.S. leadership in all things wireless. We are in the midst of an age of scarcity, from basic human needs such as water and affordable housing to the resources that drive our economy, such as labor and fuel, to existential commodities such as time and memory. There is a scarcity around all of us. The electromagnetic spectrum is not immune to this thinking. With increasing demands from both the government and the private sector, many view spectrum as approaching max capacity. We also live in an age with equal potential for promise and peril. Emerging technology offers the possibility of dramatically improving our environment, our health, and the human condition around the globe. And yet, simultaneously, our nation and the international order faces increasing pressure from our most formidable adversaries. One way to both face these challenges and to capitalize on the assurance of American ingenuity may be by examining the fundamental economic problem of scarcity. That is, how humans use finite resources to satisfy infinite needs and desires. Then perhaps this will help us to determine how best use the resources available. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato penned the proverb, "Our need will be the real creator." Over the centuries, this has been colloquialized to necessity is the mother of invention. Perhaps we do not quite realize it yet, but we are living in a historical point in time where Plato's words again ring true. A global pandemic galvanized our government, our military, our industry, and our brightest minds to keep our economy going, maintain public services, and ultimately develop and deploy a vaccine. This spirit of ingenuity underpinned our work in the Citizen Broadband Radio Service, CBRS. But the mother invention calls upon us again to address our needs in the electromagnetic spectrum. I will turn now to two more modern but just as serious schools of thought. Now, I must say up front that debates about the virtues of each of these philosophies have a record of bringing about heated discussions, ending long-standing friendships, and even resulting in physical violence. Let us agree not to attempt to resolve that debate here, and instead focus on what we can learn from each other. We can seek this wisdom in the finest science fiction Hollywood offers. If you had not already guessed it, I'm referring to the classic canons of Star Wars and Star Trek, two of my favorite shows to watch. Television, movies, you name it, I love it. There's almost limitless knowledge to glean from each of these national treasures. And today, we will only touch upon a few of the lessons most germane to the spectrum. We will start in space, the final frontier, and boldly go where no man has gone before, or woman has gone before. For over half a century in television and in cinema, Star Trek has consistently been ahead of the times, from cell phones, embodied in Star Trek as the communicator, to tablet devices. Star Trek crew members manage their day through the use of a handheld tablet called the PAD, Personal Access Display Device, to voice-activated assistants like Siri, Alexa, or Cortana. Captain Kirk would often speak to a virtual assistant and give it various commands. Star Trek has provided salient predictions of arc of technology in the real world. Perhaps Star Trek prescience will lead to more innovation, which will improve our lives and boost financial growth. Recent advancements suggest 6G may bring us to the holodeck and the tricorder. While Scotty will not necessarily be beaming anyone up in the near term, emerging technologies will add haptics and other features to current wireless capabilities, creating more meaningful remote and virtual experiences while avoiding the need for physical transport. The future of digital health is posed to include tricorder-like devices, similar to the ones used by Star Trek's physicians to scan humans to make instant diagnosis. To achieve such advantages in the spectrum and elsewhere, we must abandon old logic. Whoever learns to share best will control the spectrum space. Throughout the Star Trek franchise, Leonard Nimoy starred as Mr. Spock, a Vulcan officer first aboard the USS Enterprise and later other Federation starships. Spock is perhaps the most beloved Star Trek character in the history of the canon, and even considered by multiple acting organizations as one of the greatest television characters of all time. Spock's signature attribute was his almost unimpeachable devotion to logic, of course, sometimes fails in the face of many elements, most notably including the unpredictability of the human condition. Even with Mr. Spock's many fans in the real world, he still had his share of detractors in his fictional environment, some on his own team. During the original Star Trek series, he was constantly at odds with fellow officer Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy. In an episode titled Gaia 7, Bones and Spock engage in a classic exchange. After saving Spock's life against his orders, Bones admonished him by stating, "Remind me to tell you that I'm sick and tired of your logic." Spock coolly replies, "That is the most illogical attitude." According to many commentators, Mr. Spock is not the epitome of logic most perceive him to be. Instead, he is a straw man used to show that innovation and emotion may trump human logic or processes and practices based on the past. Likewise, when considering our challenges with the electromagnetic spectrum, innovation and passion must trump our relics. While once logical, the traditional model of static frequency allocation is now insufficient. A new model is needed to address the growing demand for access to an increasingly congested and constrained space. 5G capability requires larger bands of spectrum, and without that additional bandwidth, the United States will not gain true 5G capability. Spectrum sharing offers a new paradigm by allowing simultaneously usage of a specific frequency band and a specific geographical area and time by a number of independent entities where harmful electromagnetic interference is negated. We must abandon our logic to do this, and we cannot be wed to any one solution. For example, incumbent informing capability provides but one potential way to share the spectrum. Related and of particular importance to this group, the Telecommunications Advanced Research and Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Systems, or TARDIS 3, seeks to implement a scheduling system to improve dynamic spectrum sharing for the citizen broadband radio service. These options are promising, but nascent and cannot be viewed as the panacea in any spectrum sharing. The Department of Defense has been a national leader in thinking broadly about new solution, has already participated in several spectrum sharing initiatives. These have contributed to U.S. leadership in mid-band spectrum for 5G. What was once considered an area of concern for the U.S. in the race to 5G leadership has been transformed into one of strength. The U.S. leads the world in 5G mid-band spectrum. Between 3450 to 3980 megahertz, the U.S. has made 530 megahertz of contiguous spectrum available for 5G. First, DoD's work with many members of the OnGo Alliance helped make a sharing framework viable in the 3550 to 3700 megahertz. A tremendous deal of recognition is due to the companies participating in the OnGo Alliance. That made the pioneering efforts in sharing the 3.5 gigahertz the success it is today. The collaboration and industry partnership used to develop the sharing framework and the citizen broadband radio service spectrum is one that we want to emulate going forward. It took sacrifice, ingenuity, reasonable minds, and fundamental appreciation for the symbiosis between our economic and national security needs to get here. I am truly appreciative of the efforts of this group to get this done. We just demonstrated a path forward that others can look to for other areas where government and industry need to share. A second success in the mid-band is DoD's work to share the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band with commercial wireless services, which the FCC is scheduled to auction in October of 2021. The timeline for getting the framework to make this auction possible was unusually and extremely compressed. It was if we were in a classic 80s movie montage, but without the benefits of Hollywood magic. Filmmakers use montages to compress something that would take weeks into a matter of minutes. Normally, before NTI and FCC agree to reallocate a federally utilized band, law requires an 18 to 24-month period of analysis. Due to the policy urgency of national 5G priorities, this process was truncated to a fraction of the time. Just to give you an idea of the scale and scope of our efforts last summer, DoD established a working group that brought together over 180 subject matter experts with ship, airborne, ground, electronic warfare, test and training expertise from Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and the Office of Secretary of Defense and the White House. Leveraging prior studies, the working group developed a framework to support this auction after a 15-week sprint. Additionally, Congress mandated by statute the FCC hold the auction by the end of this year, compressing the timeline for DoD and industry to coordinate fully. The initial post-ambit work undertaken last summer was only a preliminary engineering analysis. More rigorous analysis will be completed as the cooperative planning process with industry. In a perfect world, Both industry and the government are afforded the traditional periods to coordinate and collaborate ahead of spectrum reallocation decisions. Looking ahead to potential future decisions regarding the lower 3 gigahertz, having ample time to collaborate will be all the more critical. DoD is proud of its work to make the band available for 5G, for sharing. DoD is also testing sharing opportunities with the 5G pilot programs. 5G promises a significant transformation in speed, capacity, and reliability for mobile communications. Combined with advances in artificial intelligence and quantum computing, 5G will galvanize economic prosperity and military superiority. 5G will transform military operations, collecting massive amounts of data and delivering it to the warfighter in near real time. The pilot program now underway at Hill Air Force Base in Utah demonstrates dynamic spectrum sharing between 5G and high-power airborne radars in the mid-band spectrum. As a global operator, this demonstration will help define DoD's coexistence in 5G environments shared with other users, both at home and abroad. This is about one example of DoD's commitment to finding viable technical sharing solutions. We believe that we can develop real economic opportunity with industry that protects national security and enhance spectrum access. Finally, I would like to highlight our DoD electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy. We are finalizing our implementation plan, which seeks to advance many of the things we have touched on today. The plan recognizes that to move the Department of Defense in the right direction will require enterprise focus and broad whole-of-nation collaboration. The nation that leads innovative development and adoption will reap dramatic strategic benefits. We will now turn to a galaxy long ago and far away. Star Wars fundamentally changed the way we watch movies. When the original film was first released in 1977, moviegoers were delighted by breathtaking cinematic effects featuring aliens, spaceships, and exotic locations. John Williams' musical genius inspired a sense of excitement, adventure, and the possibility of overcoming great odds. And this complemented a classic tale of good versus evil, unforgettable characters, and deep story arcs. For our purpose today, we will focus on one of the most well-known philosophies from the Star Wars canon. We must acknowledge we cannot overcome our spectrum challenges alone. At the conclusion of A New Hope, Luke Skywalker asks Han Solo to help the rebels attack the Death Star. A skeptical Solo declines, not wanting to get involved, and the battle commences without him. After rebel forces suffer considerable casualties, the situation looks bleak. Darth Vader zeroes in on Luke's fighter and utters, "I have you now." At this dramatic moment, Han Solo, along with Chewbacca, suddenly appears in his Millennium Falcon, laser cannons blazing, ultimately saving Luke's life. This gives Luke enough space and time to take a 1-in-a-million shot, resulting in the destruction of the Death Star. In Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker was at Yoda's side when he died at the ripe age of 900 years old. As Luke left Yoda's hut, he walked over to his X-Wing fighter where R2 and D2 were busy making repairs. Luke leaned down next to R2 and lamented, "I cannot do it, R2. I cannot go on alone." A vision of Obi-Wan Kenobi appears and declares, "Yoda and I will always be with you." We cannot do it alone. The Department of Defense and the U.S. government cannot solve our spectrum challenges by ourselves. Instead, we need to rely on a diverse constellation of partners. We need industry to provide renegades like Han Solo, who's willing to think differently, take risks, fail quickly, and learn from those failures. We need coherent and comprehensive plans and investments which provide clear direction. We need to establish and maintain a strong national technology industrial base which produces a skilled workforce, creates domestic manufacturing capacity, and limits dependence on global supply, and dependency on global supply chains. Fostering these public-private infrastructure partnerships combine diverse perspectives, authorities, and capabilities. Like Han's partnership with Chewbacca the Wookiee, We need to rely on our friends and allies from other cultures and space and places. U.S. military operations are seldom unilateral and increasingly rely on contributions from our allies and partners. We need to remove barriers limiting collaboration and require interoperable data sources and architectures. In coordination with our international partners, we must negotiate agreements focused on enabling coalitions the use of their full portfolio of spectrum capabilities. Pursuing coalition partnerships for interoperability will ensure future maneuver in the spectrum is not limited by U.S. capability. Finally, we need the wisdom of Yoda-like scientists and academics. Across the board, the government is increasing investment in research between industry, academia, and federal laboratories. These initiatives aim to gather resources, wisdom, and experience from diverse sources to tackle the nation's most pressing challenges. I return to another ancient philosopher. According to Aristotle, the world is greater than the sum of its parts. We need to remember this now more than ever. We are stronger together. In conclusion, federal policymakers have made unprecedented amount of spectrum available for commerce across radio frequency ranges and large contiguous blocks for 5G and future broadband technologies. I recognize the importance of U.S. leadership in this space to the nation's economic prosperity, and that 5G technologies mark a critical pivot for spectrum policy, technology innovation, and national security. Excuse me. But on a deep and human level, this is about the warfighter. When we send our uniformed men and women into harm's way, we need to make sure they have access to the information they need at the moment it's needed to meet operational imperatives. On a separate note, but one of global importance, the United States announced earlier this year its support for the candidacy of Doreen Bogdan-Martin to become the next Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. Doreen is a seasoned expert on global telecommunications issues and has served at the ITU for 28 years. Ms. Martin is currently the Director of ITU's Telecommunications Development Bureau, and if elected, will be the first woman to lead the ITU and the first Secretary General from the United States in more than 50 years. The ITU does important work in a number of areas related to all of our interests, including in support of radio spectrum management, telecommunications standards, and critical development initiatives with many countries. It's an exciting announcement of a stellar candidate. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to the Spectrum Policy and Programs team. Not only are they very talented individuals, but they collaborate together as an extraordinary team. And the best thing for me is that it is a team I am part of. I just want to tell you all how proud I am of everything we have achieved together so far. I cannot wait to continue our adventure and see what marvels our super team can perform next. Finally, I want to thank the OnGo Alliance again for the opportunity to speak today and for the spectral partnership we have enjoyed, sharing the spectrum for the benefit of our nation. I truly appreciate the work you have done to advance spectrum sharing, and thank you for indulging my affinity for science fiction. I hope soon of what we discuss becomes science fact. May the force be with you and live long and prosper. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Vernita. That was wonderful, and I just appreciate the focus on collaboration and what we've been able to accomplish in the CBRS band, what you have been able to accomplish with your team for the 3.45 service, and then, as you mentioned, the work that you've been doing on the lower 3 gigahertz band, so 3100 to 3450 for shared 5G use. Looking forward to see what may emerge there. And as a longtime Star Wars and Star Trek fan, I also look forward to what we can do together going forward. Hopefully, it'll be a little bit better than the Phantom Menace in terms of the follow-up to the original trilogy. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it and look forward to continuing working with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you to you and your members for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great one. Back to you, Alan.
All right. Thanks, Dave. And thanks, Vernita, very much for that presentation. So moving along here, we're excited to bring in a few things that talk about some of the the practical implementations that are being put forward out in the ecosystem. And so we're very lucky to have a couple of stories about these deployments. The first of which I'd like to invite up Fernando and Todd from Metalink, and they're going to talk about a PAL deployment and give us some insights there. So, Todd, I'm going to turn it over to you and Fernando, and take it away, please, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Alan, and good day, everyone. My name is Todd Harpist. I'm the External Affairs and Regulatory Director for Metalink Technologies, and joining me this afternoon will be on the presentation will be Fernando Torres, our company's operations manager. We happen to be at another conference going on at this time, so we're both sharing the presentation here from our hotel room. So with that, next slide, please. On this slide is a few of the local rural communities in Northwest Ohio, Northeast Indiana, and Southern Michigan that we serve. Next slide. Metalink Technologies has been serving customers since 1996. The corporate mission statement is committed to deploying innovative broadband technologies in our local communities. Just like you've seen on that previous slide, that's we're still doing that today. As a rural internet service provider, internet technology is being deployed through the use of licensed and unlicensed wireless spectrum and through the use of fiber optics. Today, we serve more than 12,000 customers. Next slide. Thank you. Closing the digital divide required additional spectrum to reduce capacity issues related to two good things, which were continued growth and providing higher packet speeds. For a period of years, the FCC had done little to open up more spectrum. Licensed links such as the 6 gigahertz, 11 gigahertz, and 18 gigahertz were being used for middle mile, but the only option for the most part for the last mile was unlicensed. CBRS was the industry's first hope of a lightly licensed spectrum to be used for last mile, which would provide frequency interference protection while helping to alleviate congestion. Thus, we became an earlier adopter of the CBRS by applying for an experimental license. After a while, we saw the value of CBRS, but slowed down our deployment of the then 3.65 gigahertz and CBRS ready equipment, TELRAD, until the FCC solidified the rules for a second time. After being intrigued with Google to be our SaaS of choice, we approached TELRAD requesting that they work with Google to provide a CBRS service. While there have been some bruises along the way, while being on the leading and sometimes bleeding edge, now with our pals in hand, we have ramped up our rollout of the CBRS spectrum to continue to close the digital divide. At this time, I'd like to hand the reins over to Fernando to discuss the technical side and then open it up for questions. So with that, if you could go to the next slide as Fernando takes over from here.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for letting us share, a high-level overview of our deployment. I just wanted to touch a little bit on the technical, again, very high level, but as Todd mentioned, just want to mention, we got a fixed wireless deployment using all TELRAD base stations, TELRAD user equipment, and we partnered and using the Google SaaS. And one of the initial deployments that definitely helped us out was a single step registration. So when connecting new customers, doing new installs, very important for us, to do that very timely. So by TELRAD and Google just working together, they developed this single step registration where, again, just an installer goes on site, connects the customer, and again, everything's automated all the way back from the equipment to the SaaS. As Todd mentioned before, there were some bumps along the way. I guess a pro and a con of having an existing, 3.65 gigahertz network is that, you've got existing customers online. They're connected, they're live. So when we won our PAL channels through the auction, it's not an easy just push of a button on a base station and move over to your PAL channel. There's some things like customers, were cell locked to particular channels on base stations. And so moving to the PAL channel was not that simple process. We had to ensure that, when we start moving to those channels, that we're not disrupting service. We do utilize both GAA and PAL spectrum on our base stations today now. So part of the benefit of that is that we're able to ramp up those base stations and do 40 megahertz per sector. And what that means is initially it's a very realistic 100 meg offering now for a fixed wireless CBRS deployment. Next slide, please. So what does today and into the future look like? With having more PALs, we're upgrading more existing locations with that spectrum. Again, just adding more 40 megahertz base stations out there and doing more high bandwidth speeds. And then of course, with having the more spectrum to do that with, we're actively deploying new sites every day. The other things we look forward to is some of the enhancements and improvements that both Telred and Google are looking to do just to kind of keep optimizing the deployment of the PALs, with their back-end systems. One of the things I know that I wanted to share was, Telred developed what we call the split grant methodology. So basically allows us to deploy, PAL channels and GAA channels on the same cell. And then last but not least, we continue to invest in R&D into different things like Category 12 CPEs. What does that mean? Well, it just means more higher bandwidth speed plans for our customers as the demand keeps growing. So again, just very high level. I know that's kind of short, high level overview, but if folks have questions for us or like us to go more in detail, then by all means, we'll be more than happy to take questions. And then our contact information on the next slide, to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to share our experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. Thanks, Todd. Appreciate that. Are there any questions coming in, Josh, for Fernando and Todd? Oh, you're muted. So, but yeah, I think you said no.
No questions.
All right. So if there are questions, Fernando and Todd, we will capture those and forward those on to you if folks gather them after the fact. So
very good.
Thank you very much. Very, very insightful and appreciated. That's very interesting.
All right. Thank you.
Good deal. So next presentation, I'm going to move on over to friends from Geoverse and Tasso. I believe you're going to be speaking with us next. Yeah, hi, Tasso.
Hey, hello. How are you?
Well, thank you. Yeah, so looking forward to this as well. So we're going to turn it on over to you and take it away, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Thrilled to be here. What an exciting event. Thank you so much to the Alliance for hosting this and for inviting me. My name is Tasso Zagrafos. I'm Vice President, and I lead the transportation and logistics vertical. And thrilled to be giving you a little presentation here on what we're doing at container yards and give you some context into the domain. So with that said, let's get started. So in the world of supply chain logistics, container ships are getting larger, and they're able to handle more container capacity. In fact, the top 10 ships out there today cover or can handle 20,000 containers. The top 1 and 2 over 24,000 containers. And HMM Hyundai Merchant Marine Algiers and Copenhagen are 400 meters long. So you can imagine 4 football fields long of containers hitting a terminal yard. Let's go to the next slide. When these container ships hit a terminal yard, there's a lot of activities going on in a limited amount of space. So you have a limited area to handle offloading and onloading containers off a ship, a large ship. You've got to stack them and keep inventory of those containers. And then you've got to process those containers and put them on trucks, either receiving containers from trucks arriving to your yard or transporting them. And safety and speed are important in trying to find that balance. Next slide. So I talked about more strain on processing these loads. These are heavy containers that can be up to 80,000 pounds nominally, and some even larger. And safety is a big concern around intermodal yards, as is speed, right? Trying to move and process containers on and off trucks on a daily basis. And so the staff need to be highly coordinated with management and the drivers, who are mostly independent operators, on call to a terminal yard. Next slide. And then, of course, just-in-time delivery requires more demand on drivers to pick up or deliver as many loads as they can in a day. They're really taxi operators. They're not long-haul movers. They're short-haul from a logistics center in and out of port terminal yards on a daily basis. So they need to do 2 or 3, sometimes 4 load transfers a day. Next slide. So the whole ecosystem around a port terminal operation involves really the premise that it's limited land use space. Usually these ports are around metropolitan areas like Los Angeles or Oakland or Seattle or New York. And you have more container ships arriving, and there are bigger container ships with a lot more containers on them. And then on the other end, you have a lot of logistics centers who need to handle these containers and transload the shipment, the container goods inside onto long haul trucks or delivery trucks to other local stores. So you have these 2 pressures that are squeezing the limited land use space. And the big problem is how to best increase the volume capacity that the land use space can handle and the throughput performance that it can handle as well. In other words, can you handle more containers on your limited space yard, and can you process them more quickly? Next slide. So here's an example of a metropolitan area. You have the city of Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area, surrounded with Berkeley and Alameda, and the port of Oakland buttresses up against the city housing elements and its infrastructure, and it's constrained. It's not like you can add more land easily. You're not going to tear down neighborhoods to add more land space. And then this land space services primarily the Central Valley. So in and out of the Port of Oakland is the transfer of containers to the Central Valley warehouses, also to the north in Napa, to and from in San Francisco, and Silicon Valley to the south in San Jose. So a lot of goods get transported in and out of this limited land space 24/7, 365 days a year. Next slide. So within a terminal yard, there are a lot of equipment that need to be manned and operated, some fixed, some mobile. These Tyrannosaurus Rex or huge forklifts that move 80,000 pound containers as if they were simple boxes. It has a real safety concern, and speed in operation is important in trying to move performance. You also have the processing of screening, Custom and Border Patrol screening containers, and also gate access control. Not everyone can get access freely. And then you have land mobile radios and tablets for staff who are doing inventory. And through these stadium poles, you have cameras around the entire network, as well as sensing and other IoT devices. All of this equipment needs to be connected. All of these endpoints need to be connected somehow. And this is where private LTE CBRS plays a major factor in bridging these elements. Next slide. So one of the key issues at a terminal yard, and this is video I shot from my own vehicle, is through the transportation network in the port environment. And truckers arrive with their container goods either to drop off, in this case, and then also to pick up as well. And lines can be over a mile long. So a driver can arrive, not have advance notice of the conditions, and end up sitting in line trying to get into a terminal yard for up to 3 hours. And then once inside, because of the congestion, the ability to have enough staff to process loads may also take another 3 hours. So you can imagine that 6 hour, what they call turnaround time from the time they arrive to a port to the time they leave a port, can impact how many moves you do in a day. Naturally, you'd want to go to a terminal yard that doesn't have a long line to it and isn't so congested. That would be key. But trying to get the information out to drivers in advance is a little bit of a challenge, especially when most of them are independent operators. Next slide. So here's where private LTE CBRS, we think, can provide benefits. In the initial service, it would be really helping terminal operators do better inventory management and asset management. Right now, it's more like a Rubik's Cube environment of knowing where your containers are stacked, which ones need to go out next. So you don't have to unstack to the bottom container, restack, and then find that you have to go to the next bottom container because the next truck wants that unit. So managing that operation. The next opportunity is speeding up the process through the gate check-in, check-out process. You know, this is critical infrastructure. Drivers need a transportation worker ID card to get access, which is issued by the Department of Homeland Security. And they need to validate who they are and which container they're picking up and for which beneficial cargo owner who owns those goods and which drayage company that they're contracted under. So expediting this process is key to optimizing the performance. And the next opportunity is last mile advance arrival information. So being able to educate either dispatchers or drivers as to the conditions at the port so they can optimize their time in doing other things, because congestion is a killer to performance. Next slide. So here's how we're working with terminal operators to leverage private LTE using CBRS. We're working with a container yard operator to manage both inventory management, gate processing, and last mile arrival. But we're also linking it with other yard operators as well, who run their own independent business. But as demand fluctuates between operator of a terminal yard A, B, and C, they can collectively integrate and communicate with each other to leverage their resources more effectively in handling demands that fluctuate as well. Next slide, please. One of the key challenge, you know, in any RF environment is, you know, we call it in streets urban, having these canyons basically, and, you know, stacked containers that are stacked 5 or 6 high. Basically, it's like having 5 or 6 high story building along a short, narrow corridor. And so one of the challenges, making sure you get coverage through these canyons will be key and is critical in our deployment. And we're factoring that in as we implement in our container yard operations. Next slide. The other one that I touched upon was last mile advance arrival, and that means extending the network out to points where vehicles will be arriving. Arriving from San Francisco, we'll have a Treasure Island point, or up north on Berkeley, so that when drivers come down to the south into the terminals area, the port area, and also from south from San Jose and Silicon Valley into the terminal, they can provide last mile arrival information in advance of their arrival. And that is also to notify folks what they're arriving for or delivering to the yard, so that the staff in advance can start to prepare for that arrival, not only to improve the gate check-in process, but to situate the containers to be ready to expedite the processing of those containers and to minimize the wait time and turn times in these terminals. Next slide. So we spoke a little bit about the problem statement. We have more and bigger container ships, more product being moved, more product needed to be received by these logistics centers locally, and you have the limitation of land use space. So the challenge there is we can't expand the land use, so we've got to optimize the way we handle the volume capacity and improve the throughput performance to be able to deal with the demand. And the solution to this is really, it's a bridging solution. Our private LTE CBRS-enabled network is really a bridge between all the front-end edge apps or communication devices to the back-end business operations, which are proprietary to the most part to the user. And this will help them optimize the limited space utilization they have, expedite the in and out gate processing, and to reduce wait times, which will improve the performance of the overall ecosystem around port and terminal operations. With that, this pretty much ends my presentation. And again, I want to thank the OnGo Alliance for the opportunity to speak and present our use case scenario here that we're implementing at the Port of Oakland. Thank you very much, Alan.
Yeah, Tasso, thank you very much. Fascinating, and I'm also glad all the animations work so well. We were, all holding our breath a little there, but that really did drive home the nature of the problem and also the solutions that we need to come up with.
Well, thanks to your staff, by the way. It was really a pleasure working with them, and appreciate the opportunity.
Good deal. Thank you, sir.
And if there are any follow-up questions, I'm happy to take them after the fact. Please feel free to contact me at any time. So
great. Thanks, Tasso. All right. So next up on our agenda, we have, let me invite Dave back up, and I believe, Andy, are you also joining? Yep.
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah, great. Good to see you. Dave, I think you're muted at this point, so there you go.
I'm really struggling with that today. No, I was just saying I'm glad we let Andy in. I know he had to tip the bouncer or something to make it through. But,
exactly. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you, gentlemen, to talk to us a little bit about what's going on internationally and other bands of interest. So over to you.
Sure. Great. Yeah, and I'm just going to set this up and then give Andy probably the majority of the slide, I think, or excuse me, majority of this time frame. He's got a bit more content than I do. But, as Alan mentioned during the lead-in to this overall session, obviously, we've got a global mandate now to promote and optimize 3GPP technologies operating in shared spectrum. So we continue to track what is going on around the world. Most of our focus continues to be on the CBRS band here in the US, but there is a lot going on around the world. And kind of wanted to just highlight a few things here. Most of you have seen some form or fashion of this information before. So, kind of looking particularly at what's going on in Europe, the 3.7 to 3.8 gigahertz band is certainly emerging as a popular band for local licensing. You'll hear people talking about it as spectrum for verticals or spectrum for industry 4.0. In some cases, local licensing, et cetera, et cetera. So, Germany, France, Netherlands, well, France is in 2.6, not a 3.7, but they have all made spectrum available for this. Sweden is making 3720 to 3800 available. The UK moved with their shared access local licensing in 3.8 to 4.2 and began issuing licenses, I think, about a year ago for that band. And I would say that 3.8 to 4.2, as a broad range is also emerging, starting to emerge. I think one reason for that, and I didn't mention it on this chart, I'll have to update it to include this going forward, but the The European Commission has a group called the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, or RSPG, which kind of does a lot of forward thinking around what sort of pan-European Union, or pan-European initiatives they should have from a spectrum policy perspective. And they came out with a report, it was just last month, just over a month ago. I think it was the 15th of June, if I remember correctly. And one of the recommendations they had in that report was that member states, again in the European Commission area, should investigate the possible use of the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz range for what they termed local vertical applications, and they qualified that as sort of low medium power, while protecting the incumbent services in the band. So I would suspect that the RSPG, recommendation will also, spur some additional, investigation of 3.8 to 4.2, certainly within Europe, but potentially globally as well. I mentioned Saudi Arabia, so they came out with a decision earlier this year, talking about a dynamically coordinated approach in 4 to 4.2 gigahertz. Looks like they'll be soliciting a lot of input from the CBRS experience. I expect reaching out to many of the SAS administrators to kind of share their experiences with doing that database coordination. So, a few different bands emerging, 3.7 to 3.8, very popular, 3.8 to 4.2 gaining in popularity. And then over on the far right, I'd also just mention that in Asia in particular, it seems like band N79 in 5G terms is also emerging as sort of a local licensing slash vertical use type range as well. So Japan is looking at 4.6 to 4.9, and then South Korea recently announced that they were planning to make 100 megahertz available at 4.7, which I believe is 4.7 to 4.8. I still actually need to confirm that. But they're planning to make 100 megahertz and N79 available for local licensing as well. So I mentioned South Korea. Two of the other more recent ones, which are highlighted here in yellow, Brazil, Anatel, who is the spectrum regulator in Brazil, just had a consultation. I actually think comments on that were due the 24th, so just a few days ago. And they were asking about a local licensing approach for 3.7 to 3.8. They were suggesting both indoor and outdoor operations, but protecting the incumbent FSS services there. So I know on the indoor side, they were it was 10 megahertz channelization, and they were recommending an indoor EIRP of 30 dBm per 10 megahertz. So that's very familiar to all of us in terms of category A. CBRS, I think there'll be some people advocating for slightly higher for some industrial type applications, maybe in the 32 dBm per 10 megahertz range. But nevertheless, I think that would comport very nicely with what we have in CBRS. So we'll see what Anatel does with the industry input that they have received. And then I've also highlighted Canada, and I've actually got a separate slide on Canada, so maybe I'll talk to that one separately. But I will also note before I forget that as we wrestle with this activity and where we might want to poke our noses next and try to be helpful to different regulators, we certainly are tracking this international activity. We're also looking for member input on any areas of interest or any priority areas that you see in different regions or countries around the world. So we're going to have another roundtable discussion on international developments. That's Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. So if you are available and interested in this topic, please join me there and others, and we'll kick this around at whatever level of detail people want, and more importantly, kind of share some brainstorming thoughts. So next slide, please. So Canada. So I'm going to give a little bit more of a detailed breakdown on what's happening north of the border, and then I think Andy may talk about this a little bit in terms of just some of the implications for coordination. But Canada is moving rapidly to make spectrum available for 5G. So they've got a 3.5 auction that's actually in process at this time. So that's 200 megahertz from 3450 to 3650. They released a decision or statement in, I think it was in May, talking about the what they refer to as the 3.8 gigahertz band, and this really covers 3650 to, well, from a band perspective, it covers 3650 to 3980. They have talked about an auction in Q1 of 2023. The reason I kind of said 3900/3980 is it's not clear to me at this point whether the auction will be just the 250 megahertz or it will be all of the 330, pardon me, megahertz. So we'll see how that plays out. My suspicion at this point is it's probably the auction, I suspect, will likely be the lower 250 from up to 3900, and then I believe they're going to propose a different sort of assignment for the upper 80 megahertz. But you'll see that obviously, overlaps, fairly straightforwardly with the C-band here in the U.S. from 3700 to 3980. How they are proposing to make this available for either large-scale mobile broadband services and or the shared licensing program is by doing some reconfiguring of the band. So the wireless broadband service and fixed wireless incumbents that are operating in 3650 to 3700 will be relocated up to 3900 to 3980, 2 phases, as it shows there on the screen. So March of 25 for urban and March of 27 for rural. There's a bunch of language in the decision about the opportunity for new licensees, so licensees who were to win awards at this auction in Q1 of 23, being able to deploy, but having to coordinate with the incumbent services in the interim transition period. For FSS, they're removing the primary allocation up to 3700, so 3650 to 3700 allocation will go away. They will continue to protect rural sites and 3700 to 4 gigahertz via some essentially exclusion zone satellite dependent areas. And then all of the new and transitioning stations would go into above 4 gigahertz. So they'd go in the 4 to 4.2 range, which obviously makes sense given that they're going to have higher power mobile broadband operating up to 3900, possibly up to 3980, with the same 20 megahertz guard band that we have in the U.S. from 3980 to 4000. Probably of most interest to our members, and I get asked this a lot, is sort of what is the opportunity for local licensing, shared access, enterprise for verticals, et cetera, in Canada. And it looks like that's going to be in 3900 to 3980 megahertz. So, Canada got a lot of industry input about those needs. They certainly got a number of inputs about, the applicability of a CBRS type assignment system with coordination databases, et cetera. So they have said that there will be a follow-on consultation that will address how they go about assigning spectrum in 3900 to 3980. We know that again the WBS and FWA incumbents, this is supposed to be their long-term home. So we'll see, if they're given a primary and then whatever else is proposed comes in as a secondary. About the only thing that I know at this point is it is a 10 megahertz channelization. When they published the band plan for the 3.8 band, it went all the way up to 3980, and they showed it as 10 megahertz unpaired TDD blocks all the way from 3650 to 3980. So, I'm certainly going to be chatting with ISED from my company's perspective about what they're planning and when they plan to open this consultation so that we can provide input. And we'll continue to monitor the developments. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy now, and I'll just remind you again, please join me Wednesday at 4 Eastern, 1 Pacific if you're interested in the international topics. Andy.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Let's see, you want to hit the next slide, please? Okay. So I figured I'm going to give an overview of what's going on in the neighborhood of CBRS overall, the 3 gigahertz band. And I thought I would start with Canada since Dave finished with Canada in the previous slides. So let me just start in with any developments related to Canada and its impact on CBRS. So one relatively recent development, as Dave talked about, Canada is currently auctioning 3450 to 3650. And so obviously the upper 100 megahertz of that, 3550 to 3650, overlaps the US CBRS band. And so Canada, through the FCC, has asked to engage with the spectrum access systems in the US on concepts for mutual protection of signal strength at the border between the US and Canada. So the reason for this is that it would protect CBRS from interference coming from Canadian broadband base stations when they start deploying in this band. And then, of course, Canada also wants protection of their broadband systems from interference from CBRS coming from across the border. Some of you probably are already aware, or maybe you're not, but SASs already implement protections at the border in 3650 to 3700. There's a treaty between the United States and Canada called Arrangement R, which you can find on the FCC website. A very confusing document, but when you get down to it, it has particular border protection criteria for interference from systems in the United States into Canada. Spectrum access systems are already enforcing those protection limits under Arrangement R. And so what Canada is looking for is, most likely something similar to Arrangement R, but applies to the whole band, 3550 through 3650, and then up through 3700. However, we're still defining the parameters with Canada. It's a lot of go-between. It's the SAS administrators to the FCC to Canada and then back again. So it's a little bit of slow going. But our goal in all of this is to protect CBRS from the higher power operations coming from across the border. And we also want to mitigate any restrictions on CBRS operations in the border areas that might come about by enforcing border protection criteria. So that's about all I can tell you about Canadian border protection at the moment. You should expect some more details in the coming months. Hopefully in our October meeting, we'll have some specifics. But again, we're working to both protect CBRS and to mitigate any impacts it has on CBRS. So that's one development related to Canada. So let me move to a broader overview of other things in 3 gigahertz. So if you want to hit the next slide. So there's basically 3 kind of big developments in the 3 gigahertz area, and I'm going to go through them in terms of timeline, with the one at the top happening soonest, and the one at the bottom happening latest. So we have a couple of new neighbors in the 3 gigahertz band. So above the CBRS band, we have a new service called the 3.7 gigahertz service coming in, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then just below the CBRS band, we also have another new service called the 3.45 gigahertz service, which is coming in. And I'll talk about that. And then finally, there's more spectrum down lower in the band, 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz. We're not quite exactly sure where that's headed, but I'll give some thoughts on the nature of that band coming up. So next slide, please. So the 3.7 gigahertz service, in a way, this is somewhat similar to what Dave described in Canada. So at the moment, the fixed satellite service receive-only Earth stations operate in the entire 3700 to 4200 megahertz band. That's a 500 megahertz wide swath of spectrum. However, the FCC, working with the satellite industries and other stakeholders, have determined that that band could be sort of refarmed and put to better use while still maintaining a level of necessary satellite services. So what they're doing is they're clearing almost all of the fixed satellite service earth stations out of the 3,700 to 4,000 megahertz band, so the lower 300 megahertz of that band. And then they're reallocating all but 20 megahertz of that cleared area for what the FCC calls flexible use. And flexible use these days really just means 5G. It'll be, the rules will be sort of optimized for mobile base stations and mobile uses consistent with 5G. So the remaining 20 megahertz that's not being used there, so the 3980 to 3700, that will be a guard band between this flexible use band in the lower part and the refarmed fixed satellite service earth stations that'll be in the 4000 to 4200. So the 3.7 gigahertz service spectrum, the 280 megahertz there was auctioned from December 2020 through January 2021, and it raised the greatest amount of total net revenue of any spectrum auction in history, about $81 billion in net revenue. And then the winning bidders also have to pay about $14 billion in additional funds to help relocate to build new satellites and to relocate some of the fixed satellite service earth stations that are operating in the band in order to allow them to operate just in the upper 200 megahertz. But to put that in perspective, 78 billion out of that 81 billion went to just 3 bidders, and those were the traditional 3 major carriers. So this is clearly going to be a carrier type 5G band. It's only being allocated in the contiguous U.S. It was decided that Hawaii and Alaska and some of the outlying territories still rely on fixed satellite service for a lot of applications that they can't relocate at this time. So this the flexible use service will only occupy the contiguous U.S. It'll be deployed on a partial economic area basis. I have a map of the license areas coming up here soon, and a 15-year term with an expectation of renewal. So there's various clearing deadlines. We have the first clearing deadline of 120 megahertz, the lower part of the band in many areas by December of 2021, and then the remainder of the band to be cleared by December in 2023. That's to meet accelerated clearing deadlines where the satellite operators get sort of extra revenue by clearing faster, which they've agreed to. And so those are the deadlines that we're working under. So we'll start seeing deployments in the band, probably almost immediately. And then, of course, ramping up significantly starting in December 2021 and going through the next couple of years or beyond. The EIRP limits for this new service are, pretty high. So they'll be allowed 1640 watts per megahertz in everything except rural areas. And in rural areas, they will be allowed twice as much, 3,280 watts per megahertz. Keep in mind that CBRS is limited to 5 watts per megahertz at its maximum. So there's a little bit of power inequity there. It's something that we need to keep an eye on. And for the 3.7 gigahertz service, there's no explicit requirement to coordinate with the CBRS operators just below 3,700 megahertz. However, some industry studies have been conducted, and the concept is that wherever feasible, perhaps TDD synchronization can be explored in order to make the systems compatible. So stay tuned on that. We'll let you know, as things start to kick off, what we're looking at. And next slide, please. This is the license areas, the partial economic areas in the map of the United States. But again, 3.7 gigahertz service will not be deployed in Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the territories. Also won't be deployed in the Gulf of Mexico. The band is being auctioned in 14, 20 megahertz blocks that go from 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. Then there's a little guard band shown in orange there, and then the fixed satellite service will be refarmed to that purple area, the upper 200 megahertz. Then let's see, next slide, please. So 3.45 gigahertz service. So, you know, the one I just talked about, the 3.7 gigahertz service, is on the upper end of the CBRS band. This is on the lower end of the CBRS band. A little bit different situation here, though. So this applies specifically to the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band. So that's 100 megahertz of spectrum. This spectrum is pretty heavily occupied by, excuse me, the Department of Defense for radar systems and some other systems. And those will be, a lot of those systems will be relocated out of that band on timescales that range from a couple of years all the way up to about 11 years to clear out of the band. But some DoD systems are going to remain in the band indefinitely. And so anybody who buys any of that spectrum at auction will have to deal with coexistence with the DoD on an ongoing basis. So sharing will be required in some predefined geographic areas. And those geographic areas come in two flavors. One's called cooperative planning areas, or CPAs. These are where sort of full-time ongoing DoD use will keep operating, and the licensees, the 3.45 gigahertz service licensees, will have to coordinate with the DoD in a way such that their deployments do not interfere with the DoD operations in those cooperative planning areas. Then there's also another flavor of areas called periodic use areas. And these are areas where the DoD is not going to be operating full time, but will be operating sort of dynamically. They'll have more intense activity at some times and less activity at others. All of the periodic use areas are coincident with a cooperative planning area. So there's no standalone periodic use areas. They all operate in conjunction with 23 of the 33 cooperative planning areas. Excuse me. So anyway, the point is that the 3.45 gigahertz service operators will continue to have to work around the DoD. The rules that are being adopted for 3.45 gigahertz service are effectively the same as the 3.7 gigahertz service. So they'll be allowed relatively high power. The auction begins in October of this year. But unlike the 3.7 gigahertz band, the FCC is requiring 3.45 gigahertz service operators to share TDD synchronization information with CBRS operators. Sorry about that. And the FCC has also noted that they'll consider interference to environmental sensing capability sensors due to 3.45 gigahertz service as interference to a primary service. So, excuse me again. So OnGo Alliance is continuing to advocate for protection of ESC sensors and also eventual transition to informing incumbent capability to replace ESC. So next slide, please. So the license areas are the same as they are in the 3.7 gigahertz service. There are partial economic areas, but only in the contiguous US. And the 3.45 gigahertz service band it will be auctioned in 10 megahertz channels labeled A through J. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so what about the rest of the 3 gigahertz band? So this is the part that's even farther down the band below the 3.45 gigahertz service. So it's a 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz service portion, 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz portion of the band. So this is even more heavily utilized by the DoD compared to 3.45 to 3.55. And in fact, some of their relocation plans for the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz service is to push some of those operations below 3.45. There's a lot of sea, land, and air radar operations going on in the band. And so we expect heavy activity in that portion. We don't have any specific plans for what's going to happen in this band yet, but the FCC and NTIA are mandated by the Mobile Now Act to study this band for sharing or reallocation. we'll expect further action by the FCC in the coming months, or especially after the FCC is full up with 5 commissioners. One of the interesting things to note is that given the extensive incumbencies in this part of the band, it might be a candidate for extending the SAS managed type CBRS band activity. And so it's possible it's just predicting, but it's possible that the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band could just be an extension of the SAS, and we could have GAA or PAL-like operations going on in that band. I think that's it. Let's check the next slide. Yep, I think that's it. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions if anybody has any.
I noticed there was one question that came in, Andy, on, excuse me, what are the maximum EIRPs the Canadian base stations are going to transmit at? I'm not sure if that was, in regards to what I covered or what you had covered in regards to the coordination requirements. But I wasn't clear on whether you were asked, the question was in regards to the 3450 to 3650 auction, which is happening now, or this 3650 to, I'm going to call it 3900 auction, which would be Q1 of 23. Assuming that you were asking about 3450 to 3650, ISED is kind of come out with 2 different base station max powers, depending on whether you're using an adaptive array system or not. For not traditional, for the traditional types, it's 68 dBm per 5 megahertz. I could do the conversion, but you could too. And then for adaptive antenna array systems, it's 47 dBm TRP per 5 megahertz. And I put in the chat the link to the ISED technical requirements for broadband equipment in the band. So hopefully that'll make its way back to the Hopin platform.
Great, thanks, Dave.
And I think that may be it on questions.
Yeah, I haven't seen any others either, Dave. So,
great.
Gentlemen, thank you as always.
Yeah, Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Come talk about International Spectrum. It'll be fun.
Great, thanks, Alan. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Dave. Excellent. Good deal. Next up on our agenda is what's become a regular feature of our Monday sessions, our Sas Admin Panel. I believe we'll invite up our Sas admins that are joining us today onto the screen. And we should have one more, right? Yeah. Andy, you're back. So, remind everybody you are on mute. So just be aware of that when we start up. The questions, unfortunately, don't get very exciting or a lot different. It seems from session to session. I can recycle those, but the answers tend to be interesting. So Masood, maybe I'll start with you. I'll start down here on my screen and work around. So, we now are halfway through 2021, commercial operation well underway. What would you say has been some of the learning now that we're halfway through the year operating in full commercial deployment with PALs, et cetera? What would you highlight as some of the key learnings so far?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, obviously with the addition of PAL, the number of deployments in the band has gone up, and we definitely toward the end of 2021 we expect more deployment on the PAL. Obviously, one aspect of PAL deployment is that the available spectrum for GAA has been shrunk, and therefore right now there is more requirement and necessity for more advanced GAA coexistence algorithms, so that we make sure that there is more and more fair spectrum available for GAA. That's one aspect. Another aspect that we have seen in the past is maybe a good thing, which is what we have done in the CBRS development to protect, especially all the incumbents, including Navy and federal incumbents. The approach that we have taken has been good enough that we haven't had any interference incidents. Perhaps it's conservative, and so considering the fact that they have significant impact on the CBRS deployment, it's really worth to look at that along with the federal government to see if we can make the CBRS deployment more efficient. Of course, there are other aspects of PAL deployment is coming as we speak. We are talking about some of the features to make the PAL deployment more efficient. And maybe it's because it's in the process of discussion and development, it's better to leave it. So I think I just want to summarize it.
Good deal. Thanks, Masood. Andy, how about from your perspective, any additional points to?
No, I agree with Masood. We're seeing substantial growth in deployments driven by PAL, both people who were originally GAA transitioning over to PAL now that the licenses have been issued, and then also driven by new PAL licensees themselves. So we're seeing good growth there. We're seeing that the framework we set up to protect PALs, the PAL protection areas, is working very well. The exchange of data among SASs in order to implement PAL protections is working. As Masood noted, and I like to say often, we've had no reports of interference from protected incumbents in the band in the first 18 months or so of operation. And also, as Masood said, that probably means we're overprotecting, and so we should look for a little bit of relaxation on some of the constraints that are put on CBRS. But everybody seems to be happy. No complaints from the DoD, although they're highly involved in the 3.45 gigahertz stuff, and so we don't. Their attention span has sort of gone off to that. But so far we've seen it as a good success. Everything's working as planned, and I sort of see the coming months as us working with DoD and FCC to see if we can tweak some of the parameters of CBRS to make it better and to be a little less constraining.
Gotcha. Thanks, Andy. Sato-san, follow on from that and from your perspective.
Yeah, I don't have any additional things, but I'd like to say about regarding the PAL secondary market things. Still, we are working on with FCC right now, so we don't have any good update in this time, but we continue to work and we close to getting some agree to the working with FCC right now. So, yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Sato-san. Mark, how about you? Anything to add to that, and maybe transition us into the secondary market discussion? And we're not hearing you for some reason. Mark, we're not hearing you for some reason.
Okay, I'm double muted.
There you go.
That worked more this morning. But anyhow, yeah, I was going to say that the secondary market is the one thing that nobody really had mentioned, and it is sort of waiting in the wings. PAL licenses have to kind of get deployed, and PAL users have to take advantage of their licenses before the secondary market can heat up. But the good thing about the secondary market here is that it can be easily and actively managed by SAS. A lot less complicated, really, than what it usually takes to do the secondary market in other bands. So I'm looking for that to take off. And I also think we're seeing the CBSD counts now start going up. We'd like them to go up a little higher, a little faster, but COVID has put a bit of a wet blanket over all of telecom, frankly, other than some interesting areas that really, and CBRS participated in some of that with respect to rolling out CBSDs and CBRS in areas to help with triage of medical centers and whatnot. But as we move out of COVID, God willing, I think we'll see a lot more robust deployments. You saw in Andy's presentation right before this and Dave's that the CBRS band is sandwiched between two high-powered bands. And so, there's some interesting things that are working through the commission right now, one of which is a petition for higher power and from DISH. and there are equal arguments on both sides of that. And so we'll see whether that makes its way, into the rules. But I'd say that in general, the secondary market is the one thing now we have to realize, after everything else we've done, and some minor little tweaks to the whole CBRS and SAS ecosystem. The other thing I'll say, and Andy said this too, is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is really the first time, really in the history of telecom, we've rolled out this type of a system with not a whole lot of problems. Yeah, it's complicated. We're still trolling our way through the work in the Wind Forum and a lot of work in the CBRS Alliance. But at the end of the day, the SAS works and the ecosystem works, and we've deployed over 150,000 devices. And as Andy said, there hasn't been any really discernible cases of interference. And whether that's because we're overprotecting or otherwise, it works. And so people shouldn't be concerned about it. It sits out there, and at the end of it, sooner or later, it'll sort of be just a sort of a quiet thing that operates, and nobody really pays much attention to it. Let's hope.
Gotcha. Thanks, Mark. And I'll remind our audience, please, if you do have questions along the way you'd like to make sure we cover, please drop them in the Hopin platform, and they will feed them over to us. Andy, coming over to you, when we talk about the secondary market, I know Mark was referring to a few things there, but maybe elaborate from your perspective what the secondary market, how you're going to see this play out, from your perspective, and just any thoughts you have on what's happening there.
Yeah, so for those who aren't aware, the FCC is implementing for the first time ever something they call light touch leasing to enable PAL secondary markets. So what this effectively means is people interested in leasing spectrum, both lessees and lessors, can register in advance with the FCC and get qualified to do this, to be qualified to be a license holder or leaseholder, and also as someone to lease spectrum. Once they are qualified in the FCC database, then all of the lease transactions can be handled by spectrum access systems, just as part of our automated method of operation. So they don't have to file complicated forms and things like that with the FCC. This can all be handled directly through the SAS by way of a new system and API that the FCC is putting online for SASs to use in order to inquire and deposit information about secondary markets and leases. So this, you talked about CBRS being the innovation band. The FCC is also innovating here in streamlining the secondary market process. We've been working with the FCC on testing the API. We've had a couple of test periods where we've been able to access the API, make sure we can get information into it and out of it and everything, and it's working fine. Now, some people will tell you that the parameters that the FCC are allowing to be registered for secondary markets is a little constraining. Some spectrum holders would prefer to have much more complex information elements coming and going in order to implement more complex leasing arrangements. I don't necessarily disagree with those, but I think as a first step, what the FCC has laid out for light touch leasing is a nice process. And again, it adds to the innovation in the CBRS band.
What are some of those parameters that would be advantageous?
Well, I think you want to talk to the spectrum holders. They can probably give you a better idea of what they think they need. But what's supported in the light touch API is sufficient to, in your market area, to be able to allow leasing of your spectrum over part of the band or part of the license area. So it's perfectly suitable for the kinds of leasing that the FCC envisions, but more complex arrangements aren't exactly supported right at this moment, but perhaps in the not too distant future.
Got it. Thanks, Andy. Masood, how about from your perspective on the secondary markets? What?
I guess understand Mark and Andy said all the things. Just want to add to the fact that the new platform that FCC is introducing and SASs are implementing allows a very, very high level of granularity for a spectrum leasing. So in reality, you can lease any part of the county as small as maybe a street or even a building. So the framework allows that. And also the second aspect of that is the time. In the traditional spectrum leasing, normally takes there is a traditional form called Form 608 that is used for leasing, and that takes several weeks to complete and be reflected in the FCC databases. But the light touch process that SASs are implementing basically makes the spectrum available for the lessee within several minutes, and it can be reused. And so basically two very important features of that capability are the time and the granularity and the efficiency of the process. So as Andy and Mark and others said, they have already done several tests, and we are in the final phase, and hopefully soon that can be implemented.
Got it. Very good. Sato-san, from the perspective, we've been looking backwards. Let's look forwards now into the rest of 2021 and maybe even beyond. What's in store for us from the PAL perspective, or for the SAS perspective there?
Okay. Actually, we are working for the WinForum side to start discussing about the release 2 stuff. So maybe that we start to implement release 2. Of course, once we are release 2 is supported, so OnGo Alliance, CXM or such kind of stuff also supported. So we start working on the next few months to starting for the implemented release 2, WinForum release 2, and as well as OnGo Alliance, CXM or such kind of stuff. Yep.
Understood. Thanks, Sato-san. Andy, so how about, what do you see? Sato-san mentioned release 2. What are we looking at here in the future?
So we've got several things in the works in release 2. I would say from my perspective, one of the most exciting things, and we've been working with this with the FCC for the past several months, but we would like to implement more realistic antenna patterns in calculating interference. So right now, we're able to support basically a horizon antenna pattern, radiation pattern. We can't really support down-tilted antennas or vertical antenna patterns or antenna gains that aren't on the principal horizontal axis or vertical axis even. And what we're implementing is a way to actually take the vertical discrimination into account when doing the SAS interference calculations, and that could make a big difference. Because if you have a low power base station, or even a category B, and it's pointed down and serving a particular area, and you have 10 dB of discrimination heading off to the horizon, off to where the Navy ships are or whatever, we can obviously accommodate a much greater number of users that way than if we can't take that vertical discrimination into account. And in fact, this may be one of the reasons why we never get interference complaints, is because a lot of antennas are down tilted and the horizon pattern isn't, as big as as we think it is. And so we're unnecessarily constraining the power or number of devices that can operate. So that's just one of the release 2 features that we have coming. But I think that as far as enabling better use of the band, is one of the most interesting ones.
Got it. Thanks, Andy. Mark, how about from your perspective?
So Andy did a good job covering release 2. I think some interesting things that are happening because we're sandwiched between the high-powered bands is the coordination, for lack of a better word, with the C-band at the top and the 345 at the bottom. We are working sort of behind the scenes with the what we think will be the 345 gig community, sort of within the alliance, primarily throughout advocacy and outreach, on coordination procedures, both for TDD sync and also to avoid interfering into the ESCs. You saw from the TARDIS IIC discussion a little bit before Ms. Harris spoke. So implementing all of that, in the band below, and then just coexistence, with 345, and then the same thing at the top end of the band with 3.7. So this is new, and it's interesting. When we embarked on CBRS back in 2013, those weren't part of the thing. So that's all come on since we have begun. In fact, it's not even part of release 2 so much, and it probably won't be so much SAS as much as it'll be procedure. So we'll be working on that, really intently over the next several months, just to make sure that all of the bands can be deployed without any interference across the bands. I'd say that's one thing I'd add to what Andy said.
Got it. Masood, how about that? I mean, the interference issue, the coexistence issue is of much discussion in the Alliance, as we all know.
Yeah. So if I want to talk about that, and maybe definitely our friends alluded to some of the details, I would categorize that into mainly 3 categories: the works that the community is doing and the ecosystem is focusing. One of them are some of the work on the standardization and the specifications, including the features that Andy said and several other features that we've been looking in Wind Forum, as well as OnGo Alliance. And I don't want to hide the fact that the work also that we have done on the network architecture side, enabling use of the CBRS and shared HNI, shared PLM ID operation in the 5G and 4G for CBRS also. That's another important fact that we are continuing things related to the development of the geofencing and others for private network deployment. So that's and also included in the standardization or the coexistence, as you mentioned. We are working to make sure that the coexistence is efficient for all users of the band, including PAL and GAA and FAIR. So that's one area, and all release 2 features. So I call it one area. The second area that I want to mention is, in general, all the works that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we are working with the DoD, FCC, and TIA to try to perhaps look at tweaking some of the requirements to make sure that CBRS, while we do not compromise the protection of the federal assets and the incumbents, but making the CBRS more efficient for the users. And that includes also the work that we are doing and regarding the 2 bands on the other side, on both sides, as Mark mentioned. And the third aspect that I am trying to say is making the actual SAS in intra and inter SAS operation more efficient and more optimized for channel allocation. Mm-hmm. So there are some aspects that are related to standard. There are some aspects that are related to the requirement and regulatory and protection of incumbents. But also it is important to make sure that the SASs in all their calculations are optimized. The coexistence algorithm within a SAS and between SASs are optimized. So that's another aspect of the work that I think we need to focus in the next perhaps 6 months to a year to make CBRS more efficient.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Masood. So Sato-san, a question has come in for us about 5G. What are the challenges? Are there any challenges when it comes to turning up 5G for the SASs?
Okay, radio access technology point of view, we have already supported any kind of the radio access technology. So I don't think we have a problem issue for the radio access access technology point of view. But another challenge for the 5G is the 5G normally using the wider bandwidth than 4G. So I don't know how much you can get the spectrum grant from the SAS. Some area is PAL is occupied by 7 PALs, and only remaining is 80 megahertz. So, but also the GAA operation. So I don't know how much you can use spectrum in the 5G in your area. So only challenge is how to get a wider bandwidth. Of course, that is including the GAA coils and such kind of stuff. So maybe we hope that only the issue is a spectrum bandwidth, I think.
Got it. Thanks, Sato-san. Andy, from your perspective, anything with 5G we should be worried about?
No, I agree with Sato-san. There's nothing that keeps us from supporting 5G. You know, we're air interface agnostic as far as SASs go. But, you know, again, to the extent that somebody needs to find 100 megahertz of clear spectrum might be a little bit of a challenge. But we, you know, we support 5G just like we support anything else in the band.
Right. So, Mark, the next question that came in, maybe I'll tee you up for, is there's a question from an indoor use case perspective, without SAS registration. Is that something that you want to even think about?
Well, you know, it's interesting. That goes back. It's actually somewhat anachronistic. It goes back to the beginning of the proceeding. Right, where the FCC, you know, sort of dangled out this notion of contained access facilities, where you know, operation in the building was sufficiently protected in terms of, you know, leaking to the outside, that they didn't need to do that. The comments on the rulemaking were such that the commission reneged on it, and some of the concerns were that, you know, you'd have to agree. Well, there has to be a better way to handle building entry loss. We're using a standard 15 dB, and that was fraught with a lot of gnashing of teeth to get to that. But we agree on it, and you know, we also agree to revisit it. But unless you have a better way to identify building entry loss higher than 15 dB, and in situations where it's lower, just categorically allowing deployments in buildings because they're there probably is not a good idea. You could probably do it now because while there are no interference situations, most of the deployments are not highly concentrated, so, you know, it might work. But it's one of those things that I would recommend we study before it's allowed. You know, because the other issue you've got is deployments on floors for different users. You can have a neutral host situation in on different floors, and how would you deal with that? Again, you only have 15 dB between floors. Right. So when the commission proposed that, they had not thought that through that much, and that was back in the original rulemaking, which I think was in 2013. So, you know, we're embarking on like 6-7 years from then. So or back. So it certainly merits another investigation with a lot more and better information. But I would not suggest we consider it without really looking at, you know, some of those points.
Got it. No, appreciate that, Mark. So Masood, let me turn this question to you, and I'm going to make my way around the table. You know, I know we've talked about the rest of 2021, but if you had one wish for SAS development into the future, and you could only have that one wish, what would that be? What would the one thing you'd like to see happen?
Well, it's very difficult to pick one.
But only one.
Well, I will make it very general, and that make it SAS enables the complete private network deployment in CBRS. So that's a high level. But Alan, if you allow me for 5G, can I add a couple of more comments, if you allow me, please? So I definitely agree with whatever our friends mentioned about 5G, especially wider band, and the fact that we can support 5G today. As far as SAS is concerned, we definitely can. But I want to add the fact that perhaps there are some developments required to make the best use of 5G. So supporting 5G can be done today as we speak. There is nothing that prevents SAS to support 5G. But in order to make the best use of 5G features, there are some development required, both on the network side, for example, on the private network for the roaming aspect, among private non-public network, using the edge computing features that 3GPP is developing, and using that in 5G. The device ecosystem on the 5G and the support of the device ecosystem for non-public network using spectrum sharing. Those are other aspects. And finally, from a SAS perspective, and those might not be necessarily SAS, but from the SAS perspective, exploiting some of the features such as dynamic beamforming that is very much and very heavily used in 5G. So these are features that we can exploit from 5G to make 5G development to make CBRS more efficient in 5G area. But in terms of supporting, I fully agree with our friends that it can be supported now.
Got it. Thanks, Masood. Andy, I'm going to go back to my one wish question. What's your one wish?
Yeah, that's easy. To replace ESC by the informing.
Oh, okay.
ESC is, it was great to get us started. It helps us detect the DoD and avoid them, but there's better ways to do that. And having to protect the ESC sensors from CBRS itself is disruptive to CBRS. So it's a good experiment. It was a good way to get us off the ground, but I think we need to move to the informing incumbent capability quickly.
Very good, understood. Thanks, Andy. Sato-san, how about you? Your one wish.
Yeah, I also say that same thing as remove the ESC to change to the IIC. Yes, that is most I hope. Yeah.
Any other wishes for SAS admin?
No, that is makes a lot of cost reduction for the actual operation SAS. So that's why that is most we I think all SAS admin agree that one.
So Mark, I'm gonna say you got to come up with something different. So.
Okay, I wish that the SAS can contribute to world peace. Can stop hunger and get everybody vaccinated. How's that? No, I really have to join forces with Andy and say, that's really one wish. That frankly, I think that, to the extent that we can get rid of that and then bring on these things that we've been talking about, the IIC and the TARDIS, that's the way spectrum should be managed. The idea of deploying a sensor, I was on the record early on in our comments that thought it was a bad idea, but it was the idea we were given. And so, you make lemons with a lemonade, I guess. I'm sorry, make lemonade with the lemons. So, I really think that, that's the one main thing we could do away with. You've heard about release 2, getting that done. And maybe possibly I'd add to it the whole notion of the dynamic spectrum sharing, database-enabled dynamic spectrum sharing is successful and can be applied to other bands. Right. So I'd add that too, on top of world peace.
Alan, because everybody mentioned about the ESC, if you allow me to mention my opinion as well.
Of course.
My wish, yeah. My wish. Of course.
Oh, you're going to change your wish. Okay.
Yeah. So in terms of ESC, I definitely accept that having something called IIC definitely would make the band more efficient, and I joined I share the same idea with our friends. But I want to add the fact that until we make sure that such an efficient IIC system is deployed, right, and also we make sure that the notification and activation of the DPAs and federal operation using IIC is efficient, so that the utilization of CBRS spectrum is well allowed. And until that, I think we need to make sure that we need to work on making the ESC system more efficient and make sure it works well. But at the time that IIC is efficient and it can be used efficiently in the band, then obviously I agree with our friends that that provides a big advantage to the band.
Understood. Thanks, Masood. Hey, I am very thankful for you gentlemen and the all-star lineup that I get to work with on a very regular basis.
Hey, Alan. Thanks. There's one unanswered question in the queue.
I saw that, and
I think it'd be easy to answer.
Okay, if you want to take a quick shot at it. Thanks.
Yeah. So the fact is, actually, there is a significant non-3GPP based technology in the band. That's the proprietary Cambium system that's heavily deployed in the band. We've been working with them very well. A lot of the wireless internet service providers are transitioning over to CBRS, and they're using Cambium equipment. And so far we've been able to support that very well.
Yeah. No, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I thought it was a fairly quick answer. So, but yeah, no, gentlemen, thanks again. Like I said, this is kind of like the Yankees 1927 batting lineup to me. A lot of days is You know, you guys are some of the sharpest folks I get to work with, and I really appreciate you taking the time and making yourselves available for this kind of, you know, exercise. I know it can be a little nerve-wracking, but thank you so much. It's greatly appreciated. So
Thanks, Alan.
my thanks to you all.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our OnGo Insights session. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Hopefully you guys all found it very useful and interesting. We covered a lot of topics and a lot of subjects today, and I really I think I found it very enlightening personally. Take a look at the rest of the schedule. Of course, tomorrow we have a couple of different sessions in the morning. We have roundtables all during the week on all different subjects, and then, of course, the working groups. But please review your agenda. Any questions that come up, please make sure to contact me, our admin team, etc. And with that, I give you my thanks and wish you an enjoyable rest of your Monday. Bye now.